Hello, I'm Janine Turner, founder of Constituting America. Welcome to our annual academic study, History Holds the Key to the Future, or as Shakespeare said, what's past is prologue. So, this year's study is entitled The Genius of America, A Journey into Our Republic, a study on Alexis De Tocqueville's Democracy in America. As an aside, de Tocqueville explains that the consequence of relinquishing big choices is that citizens lose their capacity to wisely exercise choices about whom will govern. William Duncan. This essay is based on the chapter, What Sort of Despotism Democratic Nations Have to Fear? Volume 2, Part 4, Chapter 6. Pages 661 through 665 of Democracy in America by the University of Chicago Press. Soft Despotism. What Sort of Despotism Democratic Nations Have to Fear? By William Duncan. Alexis de Tocqueville is known as the most perceptive observer of the United States in the 19th century. But at the end of Volume 2 of Democracy in America, he demonstrates another and perhaps even more remarkable gift, foresight. Specifically, while in the United States, de Tocqueville observed some tendencies that he thought could lead to a form of government that then seemed confined only to the past, despotism. Despotism is a loaded term. It refers to a government system where a single person or group exercises all power, but usually indicates an arbitrary and oppressive system characterized by violence and repression. De Tocqueville's unique insight was that a form of despotism was possible, even in democratic societies where people choose their own leaders. In fact, ancient despotisms like the Roman Empire had natural limits on their power. Though a Caesar could exercise arbitrary power, the actual scope of the ruler's power would be limited by differences in the groups of people he ruled and the wide scope of the territories they administered. They could make life miserable for some people or groups, but others could exist without much direct interaction with the ruler. By contrast, the despotism that arose in democratic nations, quote, would be more extensive and milder, and it would degrade men without tormenting them, end quote. More people would be impacted by centralized authority, but those who exercise that authority would usually not do so in the violent and extreme ways that we would usually associate with despotic government like Hitler's Germany. Democratic nations could, quote, penetrate the sphere of private interest more habitually and more deeply, end quote, than ancient tyrants could. In other words, the variety of different institutions that provide identity and purpose to individuals like family, community, and religion would become less important as people become more alike. This would allow government more direct access to its citizens, but it also meant governments would shy away from extreme forms of repression, at least most of the time. Citizens of democracies, de Tocqueville believed, would themselves become less likely to have extreme aspirations and habits. Thus, the new centralization of power they experienced would be unlike any that had existed before. What would it look like? In the then future democratic society, people would be interested largely in pursuing their own self-interest. Though they live around many others, they would largely be isolated, except perhaps for immediate family and a few close friends. Above these citizens, however, would be an, quote, immense tutelary power, end quote, or as we might say, a, quote, nanny state, end quote. The government would promise to ensure citizens could enjoy what they wanted and would look after them. To do so, its power would be highly centralized, quote, absolute, detailed, regular, far-seeing, end quote. Unlike a parent preparing children to become adults, quote, it seems only to keep them fixed irrevocably in childhood. It likes citizens to enjoy themselves, provided that they think only of enjoying themselves, end quote. In exchange for securing the happiness and security of citizens and providing for their needs, it would exercise complete authority over everything they did. Thus, individual choice would be more constrained and less relevant because government would regulate all of society, quote, with a network of small, complicated, painstaking, uniform rules, end quote. This allows government to shape citizens without force. It also means people have less significant responsibilities for themselves so that they all become, quote, nothing more than a herd of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd, end quote. This does not require doing away with elections of the forms of self-government. In fact, it would be more effective if people believe they are choosing their own, quote, schoolmasters, end quote. And then absolute centralized power is really a manifestation of their choice. This is still, however, a despotism because the way the absolute power is exercised, de Tocqueville argues, is not as important as the fact that government demands total obedience. It is still better than a crude dictatorship, of course, but those who are subject to mild despotism are still servants to a civilized state. As an aside, de Tocqueville explains that the consequence of relinquishing big choices is that citizens lose their capacity to wisely exercise choices about whom will govern. It has now been almost 200 years since de Tocqueville shared his prediction. How has it held up? Some aspects of his analysis seem remarkably prescient. Many people feel more isolated. Traditional supports like family and community are weaker, and centralized government affects our lives far more than it did in his time. So, are we less free? Is our government a soft despotism? These are important questions. If the answer is yes, we face a stark choice. De Tocqueville framed it at the end of the chapter. We can, quote, create freer institutions, end quote, or, quote, return to lying at the feet of a single master, end quote. This essay was written by Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan has worked as an adjunct professor teaching family law and has published dozens of articles in legal journals. He has filed briefs in constitutional cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, most of the U.S. Courts of Appeals, and state appellate courts. He's a graduate of the J. Reuben Clark Law School at Brigham Young University.